Chapter 11. Moonlight Flute. Udayin, Devadatta, Kimbila, Bhadya, Mahanama, Kaludayi and Anuruddha were Siddhartha's friends, who visited most often to discuss such things as politics and ethics. In addition to Ananda and Nanda, they would be Siddhartha's closest advisers when he became king. They liked to begin their debates after several glasses of wine. Giving in to his friends' wishes, Siddhartha often kept the royal musicians and dancers performing far into the night. Devadatta could wax endlessly about political matters, and Udayin and Mahanama debated tirelessly every point Devadatta made. Siddhartha spoke little. Sometimes in the middle of a dance or song, Siddhartha would look over to find Anuruddha nodding, half asleep, and obviously wearied by the evening's activities. He would nudge Anuruddha, and the two of them would steal outside, where they could watch the moon and listen to the nearby stream. Anuruddha was Mahanama's younger brother. Their father was Prince Amritodana, Siddhartha's paternal uncle. Anuruddha was an affable, handsome fellow, much admired by the court ladies, though he himself was not inclined to pursue romance. Sometimes Siddhartha and Anuruddha would sit in the garden until midnight. By then their friends had become too intoxicated or tired to discuss any more, and had retired to the guest rooms, and Siddhartha would take out his flute and play beneath the bright moonlight. Gopa would place a small incense burner on a rock and sit quietly nearby, listening to the soft music rise and fall in the warm night air. Time flew, and the day for Yasodara to give birth approached. Queen Pamita told her daughter she did not need to return home to give birth, as Pamita herself was then living in Kapilavatthu. With Queen Mahapajapati, Pamita selected the finest midwives in the capital to assist Yasodara. On the day Yasodara went into labour, both Queen Gautami and Queen Pamita were there. A solemn and expectant atmosphere pervaded the palace. Although King Suddhodana did not show his presence, Siddhartha knew that the king anxiously awaited news of the birth in his own quarters. When Yasodhara's labour pains began in earnest, she was led into the inner chamber by her attendants. It was only the noon hour, but suddenly the sky grew dark with clouds, as though a deity's hand had obscured the sun. Siddhartha sat outside. Although he was separated from his wife by 2 walls, he could clearly hear her cries. With each passing moment, his anxiety increased. Yasodhara's moans now followed one upon another, and he was beside himself. Her cries tore at his heart until it was impossible to sit still. He stood up and paced the floor. At times Yasodhara's groans were so intense he could not quell his panic. His mother, Queen Mahamaya, had died as a result of giving birth to him, and that was a sorrow he could never forget. Now it was Yasodhara's turn to give birth to his own child. Childbirth was a passage most married women experienced, a passage fraught with danger, including the possibility of death. Sometimes both mother and child died. Reminding himself what he had learnt from a monk a number of months earlier, Siddhartha sat down in a lotus position and began to take hold of his mind and heart. This time of passage was a true test. He must maintain a calm heart, even in the midst of Yasodhara's cries. Suddenly, the image of a newborn child arose in his mind. It was the image of his own child. Everyone had hoped he would have a child and would be happy for him once he did. He himself hoped for a child. But now, in the intensity of the actual event, he understood how immensely important the birth of a child is. He had not yet found his own path. He did not yet know where he was going. And yet here he was having a child. Was it not a pity for the child? Yasodhara's cries abruptly stopped. He stood up. What had happened? He could feel his own heartbeat. He observed his breath again in order to regain his calm. Just at that moment, the cries of an infant arose. The baby was born. Siddhartha wiped the sweat from his forehead. Queen Gautami opened the door and looked at him. She smiled, and Siddhartha knew that Yasodhara was safe. The queen sat down before him and said, "Gopa has given birth to a boy." Siddhartha smiled and looked at his mother with gratitude. "I will name the child Rahula." That afternoon, Siddhartha entered the room to visit his wife and son. Yasodhara gazed at him, her eyes shining, filled with love. Their son lay by her side, swaddled in silk, and Siddhartha could see only his plump little face. Siddhartha looked at Yasodhara as if to ask something. Understanding, she nodded her assent and gestured for Siddhartha to pick Rahula up. Siddhartha lifted the infant in his arms as Yasodhara watched. Siddhartha felt as though he were floating, and yet his heart was heavy with worry. Yasodhara rested for several days. Queen Gautami took care of everything, from preparing special foods to tending the fireplace to keep mother and child warm. One day, after they returned home, Siddhartha visited his wife and son, and as he held Rahula in his arms, he marvelled at how precious and fragile a human life was. He recalled the day he and Yasodhara had attended the funeral of the poor child, 4 years old. The body still lay upon its deathbed when Siddhartha and Yasodhara arrived. All signs of life had vanished, and the child's skin was pale and waxen, its body no more than skin and bones. The child's mother knelt beside the bed, wiping her tears and then crying again. A moment later, a Brahmin arrived to perform the funeral rites. Neighbours who had kept an all-night vigil lifted the child's corpse onto a bamboo stretcher they had made to carry the body to the river. Siddhartha and Yasodhara followed the procession of poor villagers. A simple funeral pyre had been set up by the river bank. Following the Brahmin's instructions, the people carried the stretcher down to the river and submerged the body. They then lifted it back up and left it on the ground for the water to drain away. This was a purification rite, for the people believed that the waters of the Banganga river could cleanse bad karma. A man poured perfume over the funeral pyre, and then the child's body was placed upon it. The Brahmin held a lit torch and walked around the pyre while chanting. Siddhartha recognized the passages from the Vedas. After the Brahmin had circled the pyre 3 times, he lit it, and it soon burst into flames. The child's mother, brothers and sisters wailed. Before long, the fire consumed the little boy's corpse. Siddhartha looked at Yasodhara and saw her eyes were filled with tears. Siddhartha felt like crying too. "Child, oh child, where now do you return?" he thought. Siddhartha handed Rahula back to Yasodhara. He went outside and sat alone in the garden until the evening shadows fell. A servant came looking for him. "Your Highness, the Queen asked me to find you. Your royal father has come to visit." Siddhartha went back inside. The palace torches had all been lit and flickered brightly. Chapter 12. Kanthaka. Yasodara quickly regained her strength and soon was able to return to her work, while also spending much time with baby Rahula. One spring day, at Queen Gautami's insistence, Channa drove Siddhartha and Yasodara out into the countryside for an outing. They brought Rahula along and a young servant girl named Ratna to help care for him. Pleasant sunlight streamed down upon tender green leaves. Birds sang on the blossoming branches of ashok and rose apple trees. Channa let the horses trot at a leisurely pace. Country folk, recognizing Siddhartha and Yasodhara, stood and waved in greeting. When they approached the banks of the Banganga River, Channa pulled on the reins and brought the carriage to a sudden halt. Blocking the road before them was a man who had collapsed. His arms and legs were pulled in towards his chest, and his whole body shook. Moans escaped from his half-open mouth. Siddhartha jumped down, followed by Channa. The man lying in the road looked less than 30 years old. Siddhartha picked up his hand and said to Channa, "It looks as though he's come down with a bad flu, don't you think? Let's massage him and see if it helps." Channa shook his head. Your Highness, these aren't the symptoms of bad flu. I'm afraid he's contracted something far worse. This is a disease for which there is no known cure." "Are you sure?" Siddhartha gazed at the man. "Couldn't we take him to the royal physician?" "Your Highness, even the royal physician can't cure this disease. I've heard this disease is highly infectious. If we take him in our carriage, he might infect your wife and son, and even yourself. Please, Your Highness, for your own safety, let go of his hand." But Siddhartha did not release the man's hand. He looked at it, and then he looked at his own. Siddhartha had always enjoyed good health, but now looking at the dying man, no older than himself, all he had taken for granted suddenly vanished. From the riverbank came cries of mourning. He looked up to see a funeral taking place. There was a funeral pyre. The sound of chanting, intertwined with the grief-stricken cries and the crackling of fire as the funeral pyre was lit. Looking again at the man, Siddhartha saw that he had stopped breathing. His glassy eyes stared upwards. Siddhartha released his hand and quietly closed the eyes. When Siddhartha stood up, Yasodara was standing close behind him. How long she had been there he did not know. She spoke softly. "Please, my husband, go and wash your hands in the river. Channa, you do the same. Then we will drive into the next village and notify the authorities so they can take care of the body." Afterwards, no one had the heart to continue their spring outing. Siddhartha asked Channa to turn around, and on the way back no one spoke a word. That night, Yasodhara's sleep was disturbed by 3 strange dreams. In the first, she saw a white cow on whose head was a sparkling jewel, as bright as the North Star. The cow strolled through Kapilavatthu, headed for the city gates. From the altar of Indra resounded a divine voice. "If you can't keep this cow, there will be no light left in all the capital." Everyone in the city began chasing after the cow, yet no one was able to detain it. It walked out the city gates and disappeared. In her second dream, Yasodhara watched 4 god kings of the skies atop Mount Sumeru, projecting a light onto the city of Kapilavatthu. Suddenly the flag mounted on Indra's altar flapped violently and fell to the ground. Flowers of every colour dropped like rain from the skies, and the sound of celestial singing echoed everywhere throughout the capital. In her third dream, Yasodhara heard a loud voice that shook the heavens. "The time has come! The time has come!" it cried. Frightened, she looked over at Siddhartha's chair to discover he was gone. The jasmine flowers tucked in her hair fell to the floor and turned to dust. The garments and ornaments which Siddhartha had left on his chair transformed into a snake which slithered out of the door. Yasodhara was filled with panic. All at once she heard the bellowing of the white cow from beyond the city gates, the flapping of the flag upon Indra's altar, and the voices of heaven shouting, "The time has come! The time has come!" Yasodhara awoke. Her forehead was drenched with sweat. She turned to Siddhartha and shook him. "Siddhartha, Siddhartha, please wake up." He was already awake. He stroked her hair to comfort her and asked, "What did you dream, Gopa? Tell me." She recounted all 3 dreams and then asked him, "Are these dreams an omen that you will soon leave me in order to go and seek the way?" Siddhartha fell silent, then consoled her. "Gopa, please don't worry. You are a woman of depth. You are my partner, the one who can help me to truly fulfill my quest. You understand me more than anyone else. If, in the near future, I must leave and travel far from you, I know you possess the courage to continue your work. You will care for and raise our child well. Though I am gone, though I am far away from you, my love for you remains the same. I will never stop loving you. With that knowledge, you will be able to endure our separation. And when I have found the way, I will return to you and our child. Please now, try to get some rest." Siddhartha's words, spoken so tenderly, penetrated Yasodhara's heart. Comforted, she closed her eyes and slept. The following morning, Siddhartha went to speak to his father. "My royal father, I ask your permission to leave home and become a monk in order to seek the path of enlightenment." King Suddhodana was greatly alarmed. Though he had long known this day might arrive, he had certainly not expected it to take place so abruptly. After a long moment, he looked at his son and answered, "In the history of our family, a few have become monks, but no one has ever done it at your age. They all waited until they were past 50. Why can't you wait? Your son is still small, and the whole country is relying on you. Father, a day upon the throne would be like a day of sitting on a bed of hot coals for me. If my heart has no peace, how can I fulfill your or the people's trust in me? I have seen how quickly time passes, and I know my youth is no different. Please grant me your permission. The king tried to dissuade his son. You must think of your homeland, your parents, Yasodara, and your son who is still an infant. Father, it is precisely because I do think of all of you that I now ask your permission to go. It is not that I wish to abandon my responsibilities. Father, you know that you cannot free me from the suffering in my heart any more than you can release the suffering in your own heart. The king stood up and grabbed his son's hand. Siddhartha, you know how much I need you. You are the one on whom I have placed all my hopes. Please don't abandon me. I will never abandon you. I am only asking you to let me go away for a time. When I have found the way, I will return. A look of pain crossed King Suddhodana's face. He said no more and retired to his quarters. Later on, Queen Gautami came to spend the day with Yasodara, and in the early evening, Udayin, one of Siddhartha's friends, came to visit with Devadatta, Ananda, Bhadya, Anuruddha, Kimbila, and Badrika. Udayin had organized a party and had hired one of the finest dancing troupes in the capital to perform. Festive torches brightened the palace. Gautami told Yasodara that Udayin had been summoned by the king and given the task to do everything he could think of to entice Siddhartha to remain in the palace. The evening's party was the first of Udayin's plans. Yasodara instructed her attendants to prepare food and drinks for all the guests before retiring to her quarters with Gautami. Siddhartha himself went out and welcomed his guests. It was the full moon day. As the music began, the moon appeared above a row of trees in the southeastern sky. Gautami confided her thoughts to Yasodara until it was late, and then excused herself to return to her own residence. Yasodara walked with her to the veranda, where she saw the full moon, now suspended high in the sky. The party was still in full swing. Sounds of music, talking and laughter drifted from within. Yasodara led Gautami to the front gate and then went on to find Channa. He was already asleep when she found him. Yasodara awoke him and whispered, "It is possible the prince will require your services tonight. Prepare Kanthaka to ride and saddle another horse for yourself." "Your Highness, where is the prince going?" "Please don't ask. Just do as I have said, because the prince may need to ride tonight." Channa nodded and entered the stable while Yasodara returned into the palace. She readied clothes suitable for travelling and placed them on Siddhartha's chair. She took a light blanket to cover Rahula and then lay upon the bed herself. As she lay there, she listened to the sounds of music, talking and laughter. It was a long time before the sounds faded, then disappeared. She knew the guests had retired to their quarters. Yasodara lay quietly as silence returned to the palace. She waited a long time, but Siddhartha did not return to their room. He was sitting alone outside, gazing at the radiant moon and stars. 1,000 stars twinkled. He had made up his mind to leave the palace that very night. At long last he entered his chamber and changed into the travelling clothes awaiting him there. He pulled back the curtain and gazed upon the bed. Gopa was lying there, no doubt asleep. Rahula was by her side. Siddhartha wanted to enter and speak words of parting to Yasodara, but he hesitated. He had already said everything that was essential. If he woke her now, it would only make their parting more painful. He let the curtain drop and turned to leave. Again he hesitated. Once more he lifted back the curtain to take a last look at his wife and son. He looked at them deeply, as though to imprint on his memory that familiar and beloved scene. Then he released the curtain and walked out. As he passed the guest hall, Siddhartha saw the slumbering dancing girls sprawled across the carpets. Their hair was undone and dishevelled, their mouths hanging open like dead fish. Their arms, so soft and supple during the dance, now looked as stiff as boards. Their legs were tangled across each other's bodies, like victims on a battlefield. Siddhartha felt as though he were crossing a cemetery. He made his way to the stables and found Channa still awake. "Channa, please saddle and bring Kanthaka to me." Channa nodded. He had prepared everything. Kanthaka was already bridled and saddled. Channa asked, "May I accompany you, Prince?" Siddhartha nodded, and Channa entered the stable for his own horse. They led the horses out of the palace grounds. Siddhartha stopped and stroked Kanthaka's mane. "Kanthaka," he spoke, "this is a most important night. You must give me your best for this journey." He mounted Kanthaka, and Channa mounted his horse. They walked them to avoid making any loud noise. The guards were fast asleep, and they passed through the city gates easily. Once well beyond the city gates, Siddhartha turned for a last look at the capital, now lying quietly beneath the moonlight. It was there that Siddhartha had been born and raised, the city where he had experienced so many joys and sorrows, so many anxieties and aspirations. In the same city now slept everyone close to him: his father, Gautami, Yasodara, Rahula, and all the others. He whispered to himself, "If I do not find the way, I will not return to Kapilavatthu." He turned his horse towards the south, and Kanthaka broke into a full gallop. Dear friends, this is where we pause in our story. Please go gently. Cheerio for now.